I knew something was wrong before I even got out of my truck. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the way the afternoon sun was hitting the front yard. But after living on the same piece of land for nearly 40 years, you notice when something feels off. Then I saw it, and for a second I honestly thought I was looking at the wrong property. The giant oak tree that had stood beside my farmhouse longer than anyone alive could remember was gone. Just gone. In its place sat a raw stump, bright and fresh, surrounded by piles of sawdust that still smelled like a chainsaw had left only minutes earlier. I shut off the engine and just sat there gripping the steering wheel. My great-grandfather planted that tree sometime around 1918. My grandfather used to tell me stories about watering it when he was a kid. My father hung a tire swing from one of its lower branches. I kissed my first girlfriend under that tree. My wife and I sat beneath it the night before our wedding. Every important memory I had somehow connected back to that oak. And now all that history was laying in pieces scattered across my yard. I climbed out of the truck and walked toward the stump like I was attending a funeral. There wasn't even an apology. There wasn't a phone call. No letter. No warning. Just a laminated notice zip-tied to my fence post. I tore it loose and read it twice because I honestly couldn't believe what I was seeing. Community Hazard Removal Order. Authorized by the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so ridiculous my brain didn't know how else to react. Hazard removal? That tree wasn't even remotely on their property. My farmhouse sat on 10 acres bordering the rear edge of Willow Creek Estates. One of those gated communities that seemed to exist mainly so retired people could complain about grass height and mailbox colors. Their neighborhood looked like it had been copied and pasted from a catalog. Same houses, same fences, same landscaping, same golf carts rolling around at 6 miles per hour. Meanwhile, my place looked exactly like what it was, an old family farm. Chickens wandering around. Vegetable gardens. Rust-red barn. Old tractors. A little messy, maybe, but real. That oak tree stood near the property line, towering high enough that residents inside the HOA could see it from half the neighborhood. Apparently, some of them had been complaining for years. Too much shade. Too many leaves. Didn't fit the aesthetic. I found that out later. What I found first were the tire tracks. Deep grooves cut through the soil beside the stump. Whoever had done the work hadn't exactly been careful. The tracks led away from the tree, around the side of my barn, and toward an old utility shed near the back pasture. At first I didn't think much of it. Then I noticed one of the shed doors hanging slightly open. That's when my stomach stopped hurting and my brain started working again. My grandfather built that shed back in the 70s. Most people assumed it stored tools. Truth was, it housed something far more important. Years before Willow Creek Estates existed, before developers arrived and started carving farmland into luxury lots, the electrical infrastructure for this entire section of the county had been routed through our property. When the development was built decades later, the builder reached an agreement with my grandfather. The neighborhood could connect through our existing junction point. No lawyers, no paperwork, just a handshake between two men who still believed a promise meant something. I stepped inside the shed and stared at the equipment. Dust floated through beams of sunlight coming through cracks in the wood walls. The low electrical hum filled the room. Then I pulled out a folder from an old filing cabinet. I spent the next 2 hours reading every document my grandfather had saved. Property maps, utility records, county surveys, notes scribbled in his handwriting. By sunset, I knew exactly what I needed to know. There was no easement, no permanent access agreement, no legal right for Willow Creek Estates to use that connection without my permission. I walked back outside and sat on the porch where the oak's shadow used to fall every evening. The empty patch of dirt looked wrong, like a missing tooth in a familiar smile. I remember thinking how strange grief can be. One minute you're mourning something you've loved your entire life. The next minute you're realizing the people responsible made a mistake so unbelievably stupid they may have handed you all the leverage in the world. The following morning I drove into town and met with an attorney named Ben Holloway, a guy I'd known since high school. I spread photographs of the tree across his desk. He studied them quietly for several minutes before leaning back in his chair. Tell me they didn't actually cut this down without permission. Oh, they did. He rubbed his forehead. Ethan, these people may have just bought themselves a very expensive problem. Then I showed him the utility documents. That was the moment his eyebrows shot up. You've got to be kidding me. Afraid not. He stared at me for another second before smiling. So what are you going to do? I looked out his office window toward the courthouse across the street and thought about that stump sitting in my yard. About my grandfather. About every summer afternoon that oak had sheltered 4 generations of my family. Then I looked back at Ben and said the only thing that felt right. I think it's time Willow Creek learns what happens when you treat someone else's property like it belongs to you. Ben looked at me for a long moment after I said that. Then he leaned forward and lowered his voice. Just make sure whatever you do stays legal. I nodded. That was the funny thing. The people running Willow Creek seemed to think anger was what motivated me. It wasn't. Anger burns hot and fast. What I felt sitting beside that stump was something colder. Something quieter. I wasn't interested in revenge for the sake of revenge. I wanted consequences. Real ones. The kind that make people think twice before deciding somebody else's rights don't matter. For the next 48 hours, Ben and I worked through every document we could find. County records, utility maps, historical property surveys, old correspondence from the original developer. By Wednesday afternoon, the answer was crystal clear. The neighborhood's primary electrical feed still depended on equipment located entirely on my land. The original handshake agreement had never been converted into a permanent easement. Legally speaking, access existed only because my family had allowed it for decades. Allowed it, not owed it. There was a big difference. So before doing anything else, I mailed formal notice to the HOA board. Access privileges were revoked pending resolution of the trespassing and destruction of property claims. Ben made sure every word was precise, professional, impossible to misunderstand. We gave them 24 hours to respond. They didn't. Not a phone call. Not an email. Nothing. Apparently, they assumed I was bluffing. That Thursday afternoon, I walked back into the utility shed carrying a cup of coffee. I remember hearing birds outside. A tractor somewhere in the distance. Normal sounds. Peaceful sounds. The kind that disappear when somebody decides they can do whatever they want because they have a title and a committee behind them. I stood in front of the main disconnect and took a deep breath. Then I pulled the switch. The humming stopped instantly. The silence almost startled me. I waited a few seconds, then stepped outside. Nothing looked different from where I stood. The sky was still blue. The fields were still green. But 2 miles away inside Willow Creek Estates, chaos had already started. About 30 minutes later, my phone rang. Then it rang again. Then again. By evening, my voicemail was overflowing. Residents couldn't open the security gates. Air conditioning systems were dead. Pool pumps stopped running. Elevators inside the clubhouse stopped working. One message came from an elderly resident demanding to know why his television wasn't working. Another accused me of committing domestic terrorism. That one actually made me laugh. Friday morning, I woke up to 3 SUVs parked outside my house. The HOA board had arrived. Leading the group was a woman named Linda Mercer, president of the association and unofficial ruler of everyone's lives. Linda was one of those people who carried authority the way some people carry expensive handbags. She wanted everyone to notice it. Perfect hair, perfect clothes, permanent expression of disappointment. She marched up my driveway like she owned it. "Mr. Carter," she said, "we need to discuss this immediately." I stayed seated on the porch. "Morning, Linda." Turn the power back on. No greeting. No apology. Straight to demands. I took a sip of coffee. Interesting opening strategy. Her jaw tightened. "You're disrupting hundreds of families." "Really?" I asked. "How many families did my oak tree disrupt?" One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. Linda didn't. That tree represented a safety concern. Funny. Every arborist who's looked at the photos says otherwise. That's irrelevant. "Actually," I said, "it's the most relevant thing in this entire conversation." She crossed her arms. "You're being unreasonable." I almost laughed again. Unreasonable. They had entered private property without permission, destroyed a century-old tree, and somehow I was the unreasonable one. "Linda, did you ever stop to think that maybe the reason people don't like the HOA isn't because of the rules?" She frowned. "What are you talking about?" "It's because eventually people like you start believing authority and ownership are the same thing." For the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker across her face. Not fear. Not yet. But uncertainty. The meeting ended 10 minutes later with no agreement. As they drove away, I noticed something important. None of the other board members looked at Linda. They looked at each other. That was the first crack. By Saturday, the generators started arriving. Huge diesel units mounted on trailers. The neighborhood rented dozens of them. The noise never stopped. Day and night, the engines growled through the community like a swarm of angry insects. Residents hated it. The smell of fuel drifted through expensive backyards. People who had paid extra for peaceful suburban living suddenly felt like they lived next to a construction site. Then the local newspaper got involved. Not because I contacted them at first. One of the residents did. Apparently, word spread that the blackout traced back to a dispute involving a historic tree. Reporters love stories like that, especially when arrogance is involved. A photographer came out to my property on Monday morning. He took pictures of the stump from every angle. He photographed family albums showing the tree decades earlier. He interviewed me for nearly an hour. The article appeared 2 days later. The headline read, "Historic Oak Removed Without Permission, Property Owner Challenges HOA Authority." The response was immediate. Social media exploded. People shared the story all over the county, then neighboring counties. Then local television picked it up. Reporters parked outside Willow Creek's entrance. Residents started asking questions the board couldn't answer. The HOA had spent years presenting itself as the guardian of property values and community standards. Suddenly, everyone was talking about trespassing and destroyed private property instead. Things got worse when an independent arborist completed his assessment. The tree wasn't diseased. It wasn't dying. It wasn't dangerous. It had likely been healthy enough to survive another 100 years. The valuation report estimated replacement costs and damages at numbers so high some board members reportedly thought there had been a typo. There wasn't. One evening, Ben called me. I could hear excitement in his voice. "You sitting down?" "Should I be?" 3 board members just hired separate attorneys. I smiled. That's usually not a sign of confidence. Nope. That's a sign people are starting to protect themselves. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood became divided. Some residents still blamed me. Others blamed the board. Most blamed Linda. Stories started surfacing. Small stories at first. Fines issued unfairly. Selective enforcement. Personal grudges disguised as community policy. People who had stayed quiet for years suddenly found their voices. It turns out all it takes to challenge a bully is seeing somebody else do it first. Then came the lawsuit. Not mine. One filed by residents against the HOA itself. Then another. Then another. Every week seemed to bring fresh problems. Insurance companies got involved. Financial audits were requested. Special meetings stretched late into the night. Through all of it, the generators kept running and the bills kept growing. Hundreds of thousands of dollars disappeared faster than anyone expected. By late summer, Linda returned to my house. This time she came alone. No SUVs. No entourage. No confidence parade. Just Linda standing at the edge of my porch holding a folder. She looked exhausted. Older somehow. Like stress had aged her 10 years. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. I nodded. She sat across from me and opened the folder. Settlement proposals. Compensation offers. Tree replacement plans. Maintenance agreements. Concessions the board would have laughed at months earlier. "We'll pay for everything," she said. "The tree. Legal fees. Damages. Whatever it takes." I looked toward the empty patch of ground where the oak once stood. The sunset painted long shadows across the yard. "You know what the problem is?" I asked. "What?" "Everybody keeps talking about the tree like it's the only thing that got damaged." She stayed silent. The tree mattered because it represented something. Respect. Boundaries. The idea that ownership still means something in this country. Linda stared at the porch floor. For a moment, she looked less like a villain and more like somebody finally realizing how badly she had misjudged a situation. Then she asked the question I knew was coming. "What do you want?" I leaned back in my chair and watched the last sunlight fade across the fields. The answer had been clear for weeks, and when I finally spoke, I could see from her expression that she already knew she wasn't going to like it. "I want Willow Creek completely disconnected from my property forever." For a few seconds, Linda didn't say anything. She just stared at me as if she was hoping I'd change my mind if she waited long enough. Finally, she let out a slow breath. "Do you have any idea what that would cost?" I nodded. "Probably less than my tree." She closed the folder and looked out across the pasture. The truth was we both knew the number. Engineers had already started preliminary estimates. Rerouting the electrical infrastructure around my property would require permits, environmental reviews, new utility easements, road work, and months of construction. It was going to be painfully expensive, but for the first time since this whole mess began, the cost wasn't my problem. A week later, the board approved the project. Not because they wanted to, because they had no choice. The lawsuits were multiplying, the legal bills were climbing, and every day those generators kept running felt like another leak in a sinking boat. Construction started that fall. Utility crews appeared almost daily. Trenches were dug. New poles went up. Traffic was rerouted. Residents complained constantly. Some blamed me. Some blamed the board. Most blamed everyone. Honestly, I understood the frustration. Nobody likes paying for someone else's mistake. The difference was that I hadn't created the mistake. I was just the guy who refused to absorb the consequences for them. During that time, I learned something interesting. Once people stop seeing authority as untouchable, they start asking questions they should have asked years earlier. Residents demanded financial records. They requested meeting transcripts. They challenged board decisions that had gone unquestioned for decades. One election later, nearly the entire leadership team was gone. Linda resigned before she could be removed. I heard she moved to another county not long after. We never spoke again. Not because I hated her. Strangely enough, I didn't. Somewhere along the way, my anger had burned itself out. What remained was disappointment. Disappointment that someone could look at 100 years of family history and see nothing more than an inconvenience. Winter arrived before the new power route was finally completed. The day the neighborhood switched over, I walked into the utility shed one last time. The old equipment that had connected Willow Creek to my land sat quietly against the wall. For decades, my family had allowed access because a handshake once meant something. Maybe that world is disappearing. Maybe it already has. Before leaving, I ran my hand across one of the panels and thought about my grandfather. I think he would have been sad about how everything unfolded, but I also think he would have understood why I stood my ground. Respect only survives when people are willing to defend it. A few months later, I decided to do something with the stump. Friends suggested removing it completely. Others thought I should leave it as a reminder. In the end, I chose something different. I hired a local craftsman who specialized in large wood carvings. For nearly 3 weeks, he worked on that old oak. Every day, I watched pieces of the tree take on a new shape. When he finished, the stump had become a massive handcrafted bench facing directly toward Willow Creek Estates. The grain of the wood still showed. You could still see the age rings stretching back through generations. Sometimes in the evenings, I sit there with a cup of coffee and watch the neighborhood settle into the quiet it once took for granted. Kids ride bicycles. Golf carts roll down the streets. Dogs bark in the distance. Life goes on. That's the funny thing about conflict. While you're living through it, it feels enormous. Like the whole world is shaking. Then one day you realize the world kept turning. What remains are the lessons. A few months ago, a young guy stopped his golf cart near the property line while I was sitting on the bench. He couldn't have been older than 25. He pointed toward the carving and asked, "Is that really the tree?" I smiled. "Sure is. My parents used to tell me about what happened." I laughed. "I'm afraid there are probably several versions of that story." He grinned. "Yeah, but everybody agrees on one thing." "What's that?" "Nobody messes with your property anymore." After he drove away, I sat there thinking about that. Because the truth is, this story was never really about a tree. It wasn't even about electricity. It was about boundaries. Not fences. Not survey markers. Human boundaries. The invisible line where respect ends and entitlement begins. Cross that line often enough, eventually somebody pushes back. Looking back now, would I do everything the same way? Honestly, I don't know. That's a question people still argue about whenever this story comes up. Some say I went too far. Others say I didn't go far enough. Maybe both sides have a point. What I do know is this. If someone had simply knocked on my door, asked permission, and treated me like a neighbor instead of an obstacle, none of it would have happened. Not the lawsuits. Not the blackout. Not the millions spent fixing a problem they created themselves. Sometimes the most expensive mistakes start with the simplest act of disrespect. And that's where I leave it to you. If you came home and found a 100-year-old family tree cut down without your permission, what would you have done? Would you have turned the power back on after the first apology? Or would you have demanded accountability all the way to the end? Let me know down in the comments, because I'm genuinely curious where you draw the line between forgiveness and consequences. And if you enjoy stories about property disputes, HOA drama, and ordinary people standing up for themselves, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stick around because the next story might be even crazier than this one.